German women's labor camps, established primarily during the years of Nazi rule from 1933 to 1945, represent one of the lesser discussed yet profoundly significant dimensions of the Third Reich's extensive system of social control, state-directed labor exploitation, and ideological indoctrination. These camps existed not only as logistical instruments to support the German war economy, but as gender-specific spaces in which women, both German and non-German, were disciplined, mobilized, surveilled, and often brutalized under the guise of national service, racial purification, and totalitarian social engineering. These camps existed not only as logistical instruments to support the German war economy, but as gender-specific spaces in which women, both German and non-German, were disciplined, mobilized, surveilled, and often brutalized under the guise of national service, racial purification, and totalitarian social engineering. Unlike the extermination camps or the well-known concentration camps that functioned with explicit goals of genocide and mass murder, women's labor camps occupied a complex intersection between forced labor, political repression, racial hierarchy, and the Nazi regime's broader effort to redefine womanhood itself. At the core of these institutions was the Nazi ideology of gender, which elevated women primarily as mothers and racial reproducers, while simultaneously demanding their participation in the labor force as wartime needs intensified. This contradiction between the glorification of traditional domestic femininity and the state's need for industrial and agricultural labor informed the design, justification, and expansion of women's labor camps across Germany and the territories it occupied. Initially, in the mid-1930s, many of these camps were associated with programs such as the Reich Labor Service for Women, Reich Arbeitsdienst der weiblichen Jugend, or RADWJ, which required young German women to perform months of compulsory agricultural or community labor as part of a national project of discipline, health, and ideological training. These early camps, though coercive in nature, were framed by the regime as honorable service and patriotic duty, meant to mold women into obedient citizens committed to Nazism's racial and social goals. But as the regime expanded its machinery of repression, these institutions became increasingly entangled with the concentration camp system, especially after the outbreak of World War II, when the demand for labor skyrocketed. Women who were considered asocial, politically unreliable, racially impure, or socially deviant were interned and forced to work under brutal conditions in facilities that blurred the boundaries between labor camps, penal institutions, and concentration camps. Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp, became a central hub of gender-specific forced labor, supplying textile workers, armaments assemblers, and agricultural laborers to German industries. Yet satellite camps and smaller, localized women's labor units existed throughout the Reich, each contributing to the war machine while enforcing rigid ideological control. These camps were characterized by harsh living conditions, rigid discipline, inadequate food, physical abuse, and constant surveillance, reflecting not only the exploitative economic priorities of the Nazi state, but also its deep investment in using gender depression as a tool of social order. For German women enrolled in state-mandated labor service, the camps combined nationalistic indoctrination with physical labor meant to instill hardness, obedience, and racial consciousness. They lived in regimented dormitories, marched, exercised, sang patriotic songs, and performed mandatory farm or factory work while enduring the ideological lectures and ritualized routines that defined the Nazi approach to shaping female identity. For the foreign women transported into German labor camps from Poland, the Soviet Union, France, the Netherlands, and other occupied territories, the experience was far more violent and dehumanizing. They were marked as inferior, subjected to racial harassment, deprived of basic rights, and often exposed to sexual abuse and medical experimentation. Their labor was not framed as patriotic contribution, but as an extraction of value from conquered populations. They were pushed into armaments production, construction, agriculture, textile workshops, and hazardous industrial tasks that violated every standard of rest, safety, or nutrition. The Nazi labor administration classified these women through a rigid racial hierarchy that shaped everything from their food rations to their housing conditions, demonstrating how ideology permeated even the smallest details of forced labor policy. As the war intensified, the boundary between German women's voluntary or semi-coerced labor service and the outright enslavement of foreign women eroded. By the early 1940s, with the German male workforce depleted by conscription, women's labor camps expanded rapidly, pulling in both German women and foreign captives to fill the labor shortages that threatened wartime production. Factories increasingly relied on female forced labor, and industrialists collaborated with the SS and state labor offices to establish satellite camps directly adjacent to production facilities. Women worked long hours in freezing temperatures, in airless workshops saturated with chemical fumes, or in agricultural fields with inadequate clothing and insufficient food. Punishment for perceived laziness or disobedience was swift and brutal, often involving beatings, solitary confinement, or transfer to harsher camps. The Nazi obsession with racial and moral purity also manifested through the incarceration of women labeled as asocial, including unmarried mothers, sex workers, Roma and Sinti women, lesbians, and women accused of refusing gender norms, who were swept into women's labor camps under vague charges. These women faced not only forced labor, but attempts at moral re-education, corporal punishment, and in some cases, forced sterilization, making the camps instruments of both labor exploitation and bodily control. Even German women who initially entered labor service with patriotic enthusiasm found themselves trapped in a system that offered no autonomy, demanding absolute conformity while denying individuality. Their labor served the dual purpose of supporting economic production and reinforcing Nazi gender norms, teaching them that their value lay in submission, physical endurance, and racial obedience. The daily routines of these camps were designed to erase personal identity and replace it with a collective national consciousness aligned with Nazi ideology. Wake-up calls before dawn, mandatory marches, uniformity of dress, hierarchical dormitory structures, and constant ideological preaching all worked to discipline female bodies and minds. The camps became a microcosm of the Nazi vision of society, ordered, rigid, racially stratified, and driven by fear. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the system of German women's labor camps evolved into a sprawling, fragmented network that included state-run RAD camps, SS-administered concentration camp satellites, industrial labor barracks, agricultural work colonies, and punitive detention camps for women deemed socially undesirable. The rise of the Nazi regime in Germany was not merely a political transformation. It was the construction of an ideological machine designed to determine who was worthy of life, labor, and citizenship, and who was destined for persecution, imprisonment, and eventually extermination. From the earliest days of the Third Reich, women found themselves targeted not only as members of groups labeled undesirable, but also as individuals whose biological, political, and social identities could be bent to fuel the Nazi vision of racial purity. The machinery of oppression began long before the first camps were built, rooted in decades of pseudoscientific theories, gendered expectations, and political radicalization that shaped the way women were categorized, exploited, and often destroyed by the system. At the foundation of this campaign was the ideological obsession with racial hierarchy. Nazi propaganda promoted the image of the ideal Aryan woman, a mother, obedient, fertile, and fully devoted to the nation. This vision was no mere cultural preference, it became state policy. Through laws such as the Nuremberg racial regulations and population engineering programs like Lebensborn, the state carved out a narrow definition of womanhood. Any woman who did not fit the prescribed mold, whether because of racial background, disability, political views, or personal choices, became a potential target for surveillance, arrest, and forced labor. The regime's early years were marked by a steady tightening of control over women's lives. Female political activists, communists, social democrats, trade unionists were among the first to be arrested after Hitler came to power in 1933. These women were seen as enemies not only because they opposed the regime, but also because their activism defied Nazi beliefs about female submissiveness. Many were sent to the first wave of early concentration camps or to makeshift detention centers run by the SA and SS. Their imprisonment served as both punishment and warning. The new Germany had no tolerance for independent women who challenged authority. With the passage of the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, the Nazi state expanded its reach further into women's bodies. Under the guise of genetic health, thousands of women were subjected to forced sterilization. Social workers, doctors, and local party members were empowered to report women they deemed unfit, a label applied to those with disabilities, mental illnesses, or simply those who defied social norms. This medicalized oppression created a bureaucratic pipeline that fed women into state institutions, many of which later became integrated into the camp system. As Germany rearmed and prepared for war, women who fell outside the boundaries of the Aryan ideal were increasingly viewed as resources rather than citizens. Roma and Sinti women, for example, were condemned as outsiders and systematically rounded up. Jewish women faced escalating restrictions, barred from public life, forced out of professions, and stripped of legal protections. When deportations began in earnest, women were transported in vast numbers to ghettos, transit camps, and eventually concentration and labor camps where their forced labor was used to support the war economy. The machinery of oppression did not operate solely through state institutions. It also depended on the complicity and participation of ordinary citizens. Informants, neighbors, and local officials contributed to the arrest of women by reporting infractions, spreading accusations, or enforcing discriminatory laws. Sometimes the motives were ideological. Other times they were personal, driven by jealousy, revenge, or economic gain. Regardless of the reason, these actions helped transform Nazi ideology into daily reality, ensuring that no woman deemed undesirable could escape scrutiny. One of the most chilling aspects of the Nazi system was the creation of camps specifically for women. Ravensbrück, the largest of these, became the center of a vast network designed to imprison, exploit, and ultimately destroy female prisoners from across Europe. Here, the ideological foundations laid in earlier years manifested in a brutal system of forced labor, punishment, and experimentation. Women were classified according to racial background, political status, sexuality, and even perceived moral character, with each category determining the harshness of their treatment. This rigid hierarchy exposed women to conditions that were deliberately engineered to break their bodies and spirits. While the Nazi state attempted to maintain the illusion of order and legality, the reality for women trapped within the machinery of oppression was far more chaotic and violent. Arrests could occur without warning or explanation. Families were torn apart as mothers, daughters, and sisters disappeared into the system. Women who had once occupied respected positions, teachers, nurses, artists, intellectuals, found themselves forced into degrading labor. The machine ground on, absorbing more victims as the war expanded and as German demand for labor intensified. Throughout this period, newly conquered territories were used as reservoirs for the forced labor needed to sustain the German economy. Women from Poland, the Soviet Union, and the Balkans were seized in mass roundups and transported to labor sites across the Reich. Many were teenagers or young mothers separated from their children. Their status as foreign laborers condemned them to brutal working conditions, starvation rations, and violent oversight. Sexual abuse was widespread, yet any pregnancy resulting from such assault was treated as evidence of racial impurity, leading to further punishment or forced medical intervention. The propaganda machine played a crucial role in justifying these policies. Posters, films, and newspapers portrayed targeted women as dangerous, inferior, or morally corrupt. Jewish women were demonized as threats to German purity, Roma women were accused of criminality, political women were framed as saboteurs. Even women arrested for so-called asocial behavior, including homelessness, sex work, or perceived lack of conformity, were depicted as parasites, draining the strength of the nation. These narratives shaped public attitudes and made it easier for the state to escalate arrests with little public resistance. As the war progressed, the machinery of oppression grew more efficient and more ruthless. Bureaucratic systems streamlined the process of identifying, classifying, and transporting women to camps. New categories for imprisonment emerged, reflecting the regime's widening paranoia. Women who listened to foreign radio broadcasts, helped forced laborers, or simply expressed doubt about the war could be denounced and arrested. Fear became a tool of control, ensuring that even those not directly targeted lived in silence and obedience. The creation of women's labor camps under the Nazi regime was neither spontaneous nor improvised. It was the calculated expansion of a system built on surveillance, coercion, and ideological engineering. By the time the first dedicated women's camp opened, the foundations had already been laid through years of legal restrictions, centralized policing, and gradual normalization of state violence. This chapter examines how that structure emerged, how bureaucrats, party leaders, SS administrators, and industrial partners combined their efforts to build a network of institutions designed to imprison, exploit, and ultimately annihilate women who did not fit the Nazi vision of the ideal German society. The origins of the camp system can be traced to the Nazi consolidation of power in 1933. Almost immediately after Hitler's appointment as chancellor, the regime began dismantling democratic institutions and replacing them with mechanisms of totalitarian control. The Gestapo, created from earlier police forces, became the backbone of a security network empowered to arrest individuals without trial. In the early months, detention centers sprang up across Germany, improvised facilities run by the SA and SS. These sites were often chaotic, brutal, and unregulated, but they established the principle that the state could confine its perceived enemies indefinitely. Women were not initially the primary targets of these early detention centers, but as Nazi ideology expanded to include broader categories of undesirables, their presence became more common. Political women arrested in the crackdown on opposition parties were sent to early camps, but they were held separately or in small female sections within larger facilities. The Nazis soon realized that their vision of social engineering required far more than punishing political dissent. It required reshaping society at its core. To do that, they needed the means to confine and exploit women who were considered a threat to racial purity, social order, or ideological conformity. The first major step toward a dedicated system for women came with the establishment of Lichtenberg in 1937. Originally a male camp, Lichtenberg was repurposed to hold female prisoners, marking the beginning of formalized incarceration of women on a large scale. Life there was bleak and highly controlled, serving as an experimental site for the SS to refine its methods of managing female prisoners. Guards, often members of the SS-trained Women's Auxiliary, developed routines, disciplinary systems, and surveillance methods that later became standard in larger camps. Female prisoners were categorized by colored triangles signifying their crimes, ranging from political opposition to racial background to so-called asocial behavior. The opening of Ravensbrück in 1939 marked a turning point. Planned and built explicitly as a central camp for women, Ravensbrück embodied the SS ambition to create a perfectly ordered system of oppression. Located near a lake and surrounded by forests, the camp was visually deceptive. Its scenic surroundings cloaked the horrors that unfolded inside. Ravensbrück's design reflected a combination of military efficiency and ideological purpose. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, barracks, roll call squares, and administrative buildings were arranged to maximize control and reduce opportunities for escape. The camp was intended to be both a prison and a laboratory for refining the practices of forced labor, punishment, and indoctrination. From its inception, Ravensbrück operated under the strict authority of the SS Economic and Administrative Office, WWII, which oversaw the camp system and managed its expanding network of labor operations. The SS viewed women not merely as prisoners, but as a potential workforce that could be exploited to support the German war machine. As the war progressed, the demand for labor grew exponentially, prompting the rapid expansion of Ravensbrück and the creation of hundreds of satellite camps across German-controlled territories. These subcamps were attached to factories, farms, munitions plants, and construction sites, where imprisoned women were forced into grueling work under brutal conditions. The bureaucratic machinery that sustained the women's camp system relied heavily on meticulous record-keeping. Every woman who entered the camp was subjected to registration procedures that stripped her of identity and humanity. She became a number, a category, a labor unit. Her past life, family, profession, dreams became irrelevant to a system concerned only with productivity and control. Files tracked her labor assignments, punishments, health status, and ideological classification. This paperwork created the illusion of order and professionalism, masking the cruelty and chaos that defined camp life. As more women were arrested across Europe, the administrative structure expanded to accommodate the influx. Transport systems were streamlined, with trains carrying women from occupied territories directly to Ravensbrück or to regional camps where they were sorted and redistributed based on labor needs. The SS created detailed timetables, quotas, and logistical plans that turned human beings into commodities. Camp commandants competed to demonstrate their efficiency, while industrial partners pressured the SS for more workers, faster delivery, and stricter discipline to maintain productivity. The camp system also became a tool of demographic management. Women arrested for racial reasons, especially Jewish, Roma, and Sinti women, were often considered expendable. Many were sent directly to extermination sites, while others were forced into labor until they were too weak to work. In contrast, women regarded as racially useful but politically or socially suspect were subjected to forced labor intended to discipline and reshape them. This dual-purpose architecture of control, punishment, and exploitation reflected the regime's belief that society could be engineered through a combination of terror, coercion, and biological regulation. The expansion of women's camps cannot be understood without acknowledging the role of gender within Nazi ideology. Women were viewed simultaneously as vital to the future of the nation and inherently in need of strict supervision. The regime's obsession with women's morality, sexuality, and reproductive ability created an environment in which women were vulnerable to arrest for a wide range of perceived offenses. Many were imprisoned for violating social norms, having relationships with foreign laborers, refusing assigned work, or being accused of prostitution. Others were targeted simply because they did not fit the Nazi ideal of femininity. In this sense, the architecture of control was built not only of fences and barracks, but also of cultural and ideological expectations. As the war expanded, so did the geographic reach of the women's camp system. Subcamps appeared in Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and even deep within Germany's industrial heartland. Each new site replicated the core features of the system: strict hierarchy, forced labor, constant surveillance, and arbitrary violence. Conditions varied widely, but the underlying purpose remained the same: to extract labor until the prisoner was no longer useful. When women collapsed from exhaustion, malnutrition, or abuse, they were often replaced by new transports, continuing the cycle of exploitation. Despite the systematic brutality, the women's camp system was never as orderly or efficient as Nazi planners imagined. Overcrowding, disease, shortages, and corruption frequently undermined operations. Guards abused their authority, stealing food or supplies. Administrators made decisions driven by personal ambition rather than strategic logic. Communication between camps was inconsistent, and chaotic transfers often left women lost in a bureaucratic labyrinth with no clear record of their location. This disorder, however, did not lessen the suffering of those imprisoned. It often made conditions more unpredictable and terrifying. Daily life inside the German women's labor camps was defined by a mixture of rigid routine, unpredictable violence, and the constant struggle for survival. The camp system was engineered not only to extract labor from its prisoners, but also to break their spirits, erode their identities, and reduce them to replaceable units within an enormous machinery of exploitation. The rhythms of each day, forced labor, roll calls, punishments, and deprivation, were designed to leave women exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. Yet within this brutality, prisoners fought for survival in countless ways, forming friendships, sharing scraps of food, preserving cultural memory, and secretly resisting the system that sought to erase them. The day in most women's camps began long before sunrise. Guards would storm into the barracks, shouting orders and sometimes dragging women from their bunks. The barracks themselves were overcrowded wooden structures, often infested with lice and rodents. Thin straw mattresses offered little comfort, and the blankets were rarely washed. Women slept packed together on narrow boards, sharing space with dozens of others. The stench of illness, sweat, and damp straw was overwhelming, especially during the winter months when ventilation was minimal. Some women woke up to find the person beside them had died during the night from exhaustion, disease, or exposure. Roll call, or appel, was one of the most dreaded parts of the day. Women were forced to stand for hours, sometimes in freezing temperatures, snow or rain, while guards counted and recounted them. Any discrepancy, even caused by a collapsing prisoner or miscount by a guard, could prolong the ordeal. Women who fainted were beaten. Those who could not stand were dragged or propped up by fellow prisoners who risked punishment for helping. Appel was not simply a logistical procedure, it was a tool of domination, meant to remind prisoners of their absolute powerlessness. After roll call came the work assignments. Women were divided into labor details based on perceived strength, racial classification, or arbitrary decisions by the guards. Some were sent to factories, where they assembled weapons, uniforms, or equipment for the German war effort. Others worked in construction gangs, hauling stones, digging trenches, or laying railroad tracks. These tasks were punishing even for healthy individuals. For malnourished prisoners, they were deadly. Women labored for 10 to 14 hours a day with minimal breaks, driven by guards who used whips, sticks, and dogs to enforce discipline. In Ravensbrück and many of its satellite camps, textile workshops became major centers of forced labor. Prisoners worked long hours sewing uniforms, producing socks, or repairing equipment. Although the indoor environment offered some protection from the elements, the pace was relentless, and the noise from machines created intense strain. Mistakes, dropped stitches, slow progress, or accidental damage could result in severe punishment. Women who failed to meet quotas were beaten or sent to punitive labor details. Food was scarce and intentionally insufficient. A typical ration consisted of watery soup made from potato peels or turnip tops, a small piece of stale bread, and occasionally margarine or a thin slice of sausage. These rations never met the caloric demands of forced labor. Hunger was constant, gnawing at the body and driving some women to risk severe punishment for the chance to steal potato scraps or peelings from kitchen waste. Many prisoners developed edema, a swelling caused by severe malnutrition, which made even walking painful. Starvation was not an accident, it was part of a system designed to weaken prisoners and keep them compliant. Punishment was omnipresent and arbitrary. Guards, many of whom were women themselves, wielded power with cruelty shaped by ideology, fear, and indoctrination. Punishments ranged from beatings to confinement in dark cells, from reduced rations to public humiliations. One of the most feared punishments was assignment to the penal company, a special labor detail reserved for women accused of infractions, such as talking back, working too slowly, or attempting to help fellow prisoners. The penal company was known for its brutality. Women forced into it often did not return. Survival in such an environment depended more than physical endurance. It required emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and mutual support. Friendships formed between prisoners became lifelines. Women shared scraps of food, mended clothing for each other, and provided emotional comfort. Some developed secret communication systems within the camp, passing messages between barracks or smuggling news of the outside world. In this way, small acts of solidarity chipped away at the dehumanizing impact of camp life. Despite the constant threat of violence, acts of resistance, small and large, occurred regularly. Women sabotaged production lines by breaking machinery, damaging finished products, or slowing their work in ways difficult to detect. Some smuggled documents or gathered information about camp administration. Others organized clandestine educational sessions, teaching languages, history, or mathematics to maintain a sense of identity and purpose. These moments of resistance were dangerous, but they offered prisoners a way to assert their humanity in a system designed to erase it. Disease was another relentless threat. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate medical care created ideal conditions for illnesses such as typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery. The infirmary, or revier, was often a place of death rather than healing. Many women avoided seeking medical treatment, knowing that entering the revier could mean being selected for punishment, medical experimentation, or execution if deemed unfit for work. Nurses, some prisoner volunteers, others complicit staff, struggled to help however they could, often without supplies, medicine, or proper equipment. Winter brought additional hardships. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and women worked outdoors with minimal clothing, thin dresses, wooden clogs, and sometimes no socks or gloves. Frostbite was common. Many women lost toes or fingers to the cold, and the weakened were often sent to their deaths. Snow and ice turned labor sites into treacherous landscapes, yet guards showed no mercy for falls or slow progress. The combination of cold, hunger, and abuse made winter one of the deadliest periods in the camps. Evenings offered little rest. After returning from labor, women were forced to endure another roll call, sometimes lasting hours. Only then were they allowed to return to their barracks, where they washed, if water was available, and prepared for another night of restless sleep. Barracks were dimly lit, filled with the sounds of coughing, crying, and whispered conversations. Some women recited prayers or poems before sleep, clinging to fragments of their former lives. Others reflected silently on survival strategies for the next day. Despite the overwhelming brutality, traces of humanity persisted. Women found ways to commemorate birthdays, share stories from home, or maintain small rituals that reminded them of who they had once been. These acts, though seemingly minor, played a crucial role in preserving psychological resilience. Maintaining identity, even in fragments, was a form of defiance against a system designed to erase it. The medical experimentation carried out on women within the Nazi camp system represented one of the most disturbing dimensions of the regime's abuse of scientific authority. Although the perpetrators often cloaked their actions in the language of research and progress, the reality was a grim landscape in which women, selected because of their perceived expendability, became unwilling participants in procedures that disregarded both their humanity and their survival. The chapter traces the institutional roots of these practices, the mechanisms by which women were chosen, and the lived experiences of those forced to endure them. It also documents the complicated aftermath, in which survivors attempted to reclaim both their identities and their histories. The origins of these experiments can be found in the Nazi state's intertwining of ideology and medicine. Policymakers asserted that a racially pure society required biological control, which in turn framed marginalized women as suitable subjects for invasive procedures. Within this framework, medical departments in certain concentration camps were established not to provide care, but to test theories related to racial biology, infectious diseases, fertility, or the limits of human endurance. Women were often perceived as ideal test subjects because their bodies were thought to reveal particular insights into reproduction, resistance, or vulnerability, areas that Nazi physicians sought to manipulate in the service of their policies. Selection for experimentation rarely followed any transparent criteria. Instead, camp doctors and administrators chose women based on convenience, prejudice, or the perceived utility of their bodies. Prisoners from occupied territories, political opponents, and Jewish women were disproportionately targeted because they lacked legal protection and could be removed from barracks without explanation. Many women were informed only moments before procedures were carried out, while others became aware of their selection through changes in routine or the sudden disappearance of peers. This atmosphere of unpredictable danger further eroded the sense of community within the camp, as women feared both the unknown and the arbitrary. Inside the makeshift laboratories and hospital blocks, conditions were stark and inadequately equipped, despite the official claims of scientific rigor. Instruments were often unsterilized, and procedures were conducted without appropriate anesthesia or follow-up care. The women who were subjected to experimental treatments, injections, or surgeries frequently had no understanding of what was being done to them or why. The lack of communication served a dual purpose for the perpetrators. It minimized resistance and reinforced a sense of helplessness among prisoners. The secrecy surrounding these procedures also meant that many women could not fully recount what they had endured until long after liberation. The psychological environment of the camp medical blocks shaped the experiences of women as deeply as the procedures themselves. Rumors spread quickly among prisoners, creating both dread and solidarity. Some women attempted to hide among work details to avoid being taken, while others relied on informal networks within the barracks to warn one another of impending selections. Those who worked in camp infirmaries, often prisoners themselves, faced impossible choices as they witnessed the suffering of others while lacking the authority to intervene. These moral dilemmas left lasting emotional scars, highlighting the ways in which coercion extended beyond the individuals directly experimented upon. Despite the overwhelming power imbalance, women found ways to resist. Resistance took many forms: concealing symptoms to avoid selection, exchanging information about the doctor's routines, or supporting one another during recovery from procedures. In some cases, women destroyed records or altered medical reports, hoping to protect others from similar fates. These acts, though small when measured against the brutality of the camp system, demonstrated extraordinary courage and helped shape the collective memory of survival. The persistence of these testimonies played a crucial role in post-war efforts to document crimes and demand accountability. The aftermath of experimentation continued long after the war's end. Many survivors left the camps with chronic pain, infertility, or other lasting medical complications that shaped their lives. The search for adequate health care in the post-war years proved difficult, as physicians outside the camp system often struggled to understand or treat injuries that had no parallels in civilian medicine. Women confronted not only the physical consequences of their experiences, but also the emotional strain of returning to societies that were often ill-prepared to acknowledge the full extent of wartime atrocities. Silence, denial, or bureaucratic barriers frequently impeded their attempts to obtain recognition or support. Legal proceedings offered some path toward justice, although the process was uneven and deeply influenced by political shifts in the post-war decades. Documentation collected from survivors' testimonies became crucial evidence in trials against camp doctors and administrators. Yet not all perpetrators were prosecuted, and not all survivors received compensation. These disparities left many women with unresolved grievances, reinforcing the sense that their suffering had been marginalized. Nonetheless, the efforts of survivors to share their stories played a vital role in shaping international legal norms related to human experimentation and informed consent. The legacy of these women extends far beyond the historical record of the camps. Their testimonies prompted broader ethical debates within medicine, influencing the development of guidelines designed to protect human subjects from exploitation. Many survivors became advocates for education and remembrance, emphasizing the importance of accurate historical documentation. Their work contributed to a deeper understanding of how political ideology can corrupt scientific practice, and how vulnerable populations can be targeted through misused authority. As the trajectory of World War II shifted decisively against Nazi Germany, the system of women's labor camps entered a period defined by uncertainty, panic, and escalating brutality. The instability of the front lines forced the SS to reorganize, evacuate, or abandon camps with little warning. For the women imprisoned within them, this final phase of the war brought new forms of danger. The routines of forced labor and punishment that had dominated their lives were replaced with chaotic transfers, violent marches, and the unpredictable cruelty of guards who themselves felt the pressure of an impending collapse. This chapter examines the unraveling of the camp system, the experiences of women caught in the maelstrom of evacuations, and the lasting psychological scars left by these final months. By late 1943, the German war machine was straining under the pressures of defeat on multiple fronts. Supplies dwindled, communication lines broke down, and the SS struggled to maintain control over its vast network of concentration, labor, and transit camps. For women prisoners, this meant that even the harsh stability of daily camp routines began to dissolve. Food rations, already meager, were cut further. Medical care, never adequate, became nearly non-existent. Guards grew increasingly unpredictable, their discipline cracking as military oversight weakened. This combination of desperation and disorganization set the stage for the mass evacuations that would define the final 2 years of the conflict. Evacuations often began with sudden, disorienting announcements. Prisoners were ordered to assemble with only what they could carry. Some women never learned the reasons behind their forced transfer, while others overheard guards speaking of advancing armies or the need to destroy evidence of camp conditions. In many cases, the evacuations were hurried attempts to relocate forced laborers to sites deeper within German territory, where production could continue. Women were driven onto overcrowded trains, trucks, or, in the most brutal instances, forced to march on foot for days or weeks at a time. These so-called death marches became one of the most defining atrocities of the war's final stage. Transportation by rail was fraught with danger. Cattle cars, already symbols of the dehumanizing machinery of the camps, now became sites of intensified suffering. Women were packed so tightly that movement was nearly impossible, leaving them to endure long journeys without sanitation, water, or fresh air. The trains often lingered on tracks for days due to bombed railways or confusion within military logistics. Some women died from suffocation, dehydration, or untreated wounds before reaching their destination. Others attempted to escape when doors were briefly opened, but such attempts were met with immediate and often fatal retaliation. For many, the marches were even harrowing than transport by rail. Guards forced women to cover vast distances, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, through snow, rain, or extreme cold. The pace was relentless, and anyone who faltered risked being beaten or shot. The marches took place along roads littered with debris from collapsed infrastructure, and the prisoners often passed through villages where civilians, themselves exhausted by war, responded with indifference, hostility, or occasional covert acts of compassion. Women relied on one another for survival, sharing scraps of food or physically supporting those most at risk of collapse. Even so, the mortality rate on these marches was devastating. As the German command structure unraveled, inconsistencies grew between different groups of guards. Some maintained strict and violent control, while others, fearful of capture, prosecution, or death, became increasingly apathetic or even fled, leaving women unsupervised. In rare cases, prisoners managed to hide in forests or abandoned buildings before the arrival of liberation forces. However, for most women, the uncertainty of these final weeks only deepened their suffering. They could not know whether the chaos signaled imminent rescue or greater peril. The collapse of camp order also led to the destruction of documents, equipment, and evidence. SS personnel burned files, dismantled structures, or abandoned entire sites. This left many women with no trace of their imprisonment beyond personal memory and, in some cases, physical injuries. The absence of records later complicated post-war identification and legal processes, adding another layer of trauma to an already fractured reality. The attempt to erase evidence was not only a bureaucratic act, but also a final assault on the identities of those imprisoned. During evacuations, women experienced extreme physical and emotional strain. Malnutrition and dehydration weakened their bodies, while the stress of constant movement and unpredictable violence eroded their psychological resilience. Yet many survivors later recalled moments of profound solidarity, women sharing sips of contaminated water, redistributing clothing, or exchanging whispered encouragement in the darkness. These small acts served as lifelines, helping them preserve a sense of humanity in circumstances explicitly designed to destroy it. The fear of frontline combat added another layer of uncertainty. As women were moved closer to active battle zones, they heard artillery fire, aircraft, and clashes between advancing Allied forces and retreating German units. Guards grew increasingly anxious and aggressive, redirecting their frustration toward prisoners. Some women were used as human shields or forced into positions that put them directly in harm's way. Others were abandoned on roadsides or left locked in rail cars as guards fled approaching armies. Despite the overwhelming danger, the final weeks before liberation also marked the beginning of hope for many women. Rumors circulated through prisoner communities. Stories of Soviet, American, British, or Canadian troops liberating other camps. Even without concrete information, the sense that the war was nearing its end provided some psychological strength. This fragile hope, however, was tempered by the reality that survival remained an hour-to-hour challenge. The experiences of women during this period varied widely depending on geography, camp conditions, and the behavior of individual guards. Yet common themes, chaos, fear, exhaustion, and solidarity, formed the foundation of the historical record. The disintegration of the Nazi camp system did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it revealed the full extent of its brutality as structure gave way to desperation. The women who survived the final phase of the war did so through a combination of resilience, mutual support, luck, and unyielding determination to endure. Liberation for the women imprisoned in German labor and concentration camps did not arrive as a single moment of triumph, but rather as a complex, disorienting transition between terror and an uncertain future. The collapse of the Nazi regime unfolded unevenly across Europe, and so too did the experiences of those held within its vast camp system. In many cases, women were liberated not from the structured confines of camps, but from the chaos of evacuation transports, death marches, or makeshift detention sites suddenly abandoned by fleeing guards. This chapter examines the final hours before liberation, the immediate aftermath of freedom, and the profound legacy carried by survivors, whose voices now form the core of historical memory. The first signs of liberation were often indirect: artillery fire approaching from nearby towns, the sight of German guards deserting their posts, or the sudden stillness in daily routines that had once been governed by relentless commands. Women who had survived years of forced labor, medical experiments, hunger, and brutality found themselves in a surreal state of anticipation. They had endured too much to trust that change, real change, was at hand. Many survivors later recalled that they were unable to comprehend what was happening until Allied soldiers physically entered their space and assured them that the war, for them, was over. When liberation finally arrived, it brought both relief and shock. Soldiers from the Soviet, American, British, and Canadian forces encountered women who were emaciated, sick, and psychologically exhausted. The liberators themselves were often unprepared for the scale of suffering they found. In some camps, medical units were quickly deployed to provide emergency care, while in other locations, improvised aid stations had to be established in the ruins of abandoned barracks. Women who had not walked freely in years struggled to move without assistance. Many were unable to stand. The liberators' first tasks were often the most basic, providing food, clean water, and medical attention to stabilize those near death. Yet liberation did not instantly erase the effects of imprisonment. Many women experienced fear when soldiers approached them, as uniforms had long been associated with danger. Others could not immediately distinguish between guards and liberators. In some cases, communication barriers made the situation even more confusing. It took time, hours, days, sometimes longer, for the reality of freedom to settle in. Tears, silence, disbelief, and even emotional numbness were common responses. Survivors often described these early moments not as celebrations, but as experiences of profound fragility. Medical recovery, where possible, became a central focus in the days after liberation. Women suffering from advanced starvation required carefully controlled nutrition to avoid refeeding complications. Those with infected wounds, untreated fractures, or illnesses such as typhus and tuberculosis needed urgent intervention. Facilities were established in repurposed hospitals, schools, or military tents. The process of physical healing was slow and, for many, incomplete. Chronic pain, reproductive complications, and long-term disabilities became lifelong consequences of their imprisonment. Alongside physical recovery was the monumental challenge of emotional and psychological healing. The trauma of the camps did not end at liberation. Instead, it resurfaced in new and often unexpected ways. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, and survivors' guilt shaped the early months and years after the war. Many women struggled to speak about what they had endured. The absence of family members, lost to war, deportation, or execution, magnified the sense of displacement. Some survivors found themselves in displaced persons camps for months or years, uncertain of where to go or whether home still existed. Rebuilding life required navigating a world profoundly altered by war. Some women attempted to return to their hometowns only to find them destroyed or occupied by unfamiliar authorities. Others discovered that their property had been seized or that neighbors were unwilling to acknowledge what had happened to them. In certain regions, survivors faced suspicion or hostility, particularly when political tensions shaped post-war narratives. For Jewish survivors, the loss of entire communities compounded the struggle to rebuild identity and belonging. Despite these hardships, many women demonstrated extraordinary resilience. They formed new families, pursued education, built careers, and engaged in community work. Some chose to bury their memories deeply, seeking to construct a future unburdened by the horrors of the past. Others became dedicated witnesses, committed to sharing their experiences so that history would not forget. Their testimonies, captured in interviews, written memoirs, court proceedings, and educational programs, have become foundational to the global understanding of the Holocaust and wartime atrocities. The pursuit of justice in the post-war years brought survivors into courtrooms where they faced former guards, camp doctors, and SS administrators. Their testimonies were critical in establishing historical truth and securing convictions. Yet the legal process was not always satisfactory. Some perpetrators escaped prosecution, and political shifts during the Cold War influenced which cases were pursued. Survivors often felt that no legal outcome could adequately address the enormity of the crimes committed. Still, their courage in speaking out ensured that a comprehensive record existed, forming a crucial cornerstone of international human rights law. Over time, the legacy of these women took shape not only through legal testimony, but also through education, scholarship, and memorialization. Museums, monuments, and research centers around the world now preserve their stories. These institutions emphasize the importance of personal narratives, recognizing that numbers alone cannot convey the depth of human suffering or the magnitude of endurance. Through letters, diaries, photographs, and oral histories, the voices of survivors continue to resonate across generations, offering insight into the mechanisms of oppression and the resilience of those who defied it. In contemporary discourse, the experiences of women in the camps have also informed broader conversations about gender, power, and resistance. Scholars have highlighted the specific vulnerabilities women faced, such as sexual violence, reproductive coercion, and gendered labor, as well as the unique forms of solidarity they cultivated. Their stories complicate simplistic portrayals of victimhood by revealing the nuanced ways in which women resisted, survived, and, in many cases, rebuilt their lives with extraordinary strength.